This is historian Siri, and I would like to welcome you to Romansky's Realm. Today we're going to talk about the organization of the Hispanic American rights movement. Hispanic Americans, a minority comprised of Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans, those who hail from Central America, and those from South America, were a minority group largely discriminated against in the 1970s and 1980s, when they began demanding their rights. This movement was caused largely by a lack of representation in government, discrimination against Hispanic Americans in public, and Hispanic farm workers' lack of rights, all legitimate issues that had to be resolved. The goals of the movement were to resolve these issues by getting more rights for workers, creating a political party to elect Hispanic Americans to office, and stopping public discrimination against Hispanic Americans through passing laws using those elected to office. The movement used various methods to gain these reforms. The most prevalent was peaceful protest. An organization called the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC, coordinated peaceful protests, including strikes, sit-ins, and a very successful boycott of grapes that eventually led to grape growers providing more rights to their farm workers. Additionally, Hispanic Americans used peaceful assembly to reach their goals, coordinating a political party for Hispanic Americans that elected two candidates to office soon after it was formed, giving Hispanic Americans representation in government. Cesar Chavez was the head of the peaceful protest by the UFWOC, and believed in only peaceful demonstrations. As he stated while leading the movement, people don't like to see a non-violent movement subjected to violence. That is the key thing we have going for us. Mr. Chavez drew inspiration from India's Mahatma Gandhi and the US's civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Caesar was very similar to Dr. King, and used many of Dr. King's peaceful tactics in his protests, including limiting violence in response to violence enacted by whites against the Hispanic American population. The movement faced resistance from the grape growers and, surprisingly, from the upper echelons of government. Growers insisted that farm workers were paid the best in the country and that they did not want to organize into unions, and President Nixon, along with Governor of California Ronald Reagan, sided with the growers. When the boycott started, the growers insisted that it was illegal under a government provision preventing union workers from creating a boycott of products. President Nixon and Governor Reagan agreed. However, the UFWOC was able to argue that since its workers were unable to unionize, this law did not apply to them. Another obstacle the UFWOC had to face was the expansion of the boycott, due to the company they were targeting changing its label. Since the movement could no longer target any specific company, they were forced to create a boycott of table grapes altogether. This opposition played a minor role in the Hispanic rights movement, and the movement's organizations were able to move past it with relative ease. The movement was a success because it managed to do everything it set out to do. It secured rights for workers, put Hispanic American representation in government, and managed to stop much of the discrimination in public. If there was one shortcoming of the movement, it was that it didn't seek government legislation, and instead decided to pressure the growers and others directly, which gave their opposition room to circumvent their efforts to a degree. The goals of the movement were met as completely as they could be. The short-term effects of the movement were that Hispanic Americans were represented in government and conditions for farm workers improved drastically due to negotiations of unions with growers. The long-term effects of the movement were that Hispanic Americans were able to use their newfound governmental might to pass immigration laws, advocate for bilingual school, oppose discrimination, and elect Hispanic Americans to government posts, and that grassroots change and boycotts were shown to be a device for social change and used by other organizations in the future. Now, let's compare the Hispanic American rights movement to the civil rights movement. First things first, the Hispanic rights movement was astonishing for its diversity, and the people that joined it were varied in their beliefs, values, and goals. By contrast, the civil rights movement was made up of people with the same goal, to end segregation and discrimination. There were some disagreements among members of SNCC as to how integration and segregation should be dealt with, but in the larger scope of the movement, the goal was the same: to end discrimination. Secondly, the Hispanic rights movement gave large consideration to economic issues, such as unequal employment for Hispanic Americans. By contrast, the civil rights movement focused almost solely on political rights for African Americans, and overlooked many economic hardships for African Americans. This was perhaps the civil rights movement's greatest failure. A similarity between the civil rights movement and the Hispanic rights movement was that both featured a prominent leader who believed in calm, peaceful protests and persisted even through violence. Finally, both the civil rights movement and the Hispanic rights movement managed to complete their goals, although the Hispanic rights movement seems to have more completely grasped what they set out to do, as economic status can still segregate African Americans in cities, while Hispanic Americans have established themselves economically through their movement. Through this research, it is apparent that the civil rights movement inspired many changes for the better in America, and its peaceful tactics, just protest, and core values live on to the present day. This has been Romanski's Realm. Thank you for listening.